Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the truth of Jesus Christ that has come down to us from the apostles over 2,000 years. Today, we're going to be speaking about the Orthodox churches, Catholicism versus Orthodoxy. And I put Orthodoxy in quotes, but, it's a very important topic because there's been a rise of militant Orthodox apologists online who I find not to be convincing. They're convinced of their own position, but to me, it's more of an emotional position. And they critique and they condemn Catholicism, but they don't have a lot of good arguments. But we still need to know how to respond to these arguments, because we believe that the Catholic Church is the true church of Jesus Christ, and that, the Orthodox, we love them. They're our brothers, but they departed from us. And, we do pray for full unity someday. So, I think these topics between us, these disagreements, these misunderstandings, they need to be addressed with charity, with compassion, with love. And so we're going to be doing that today. And I can't think of a better way to do that than with this book, Answering Orthodoxy. It's a Catholic response to attacks from the East. And it's a great book that pretty much covers every objection that you're going to hear from the Orthodox churches. And it tells you how to answer it. So they say this is why Catholicism's wrong, but this book shows, no, this is why these are misunderstandings. Here's where the arguments go wrong and why Catholicism is right. So to help us talk about this today, we are bringing on the author, Michael LOFTON, who has written this book. And really, it's a great book full of many facts. You can buy it on Catholic Answers Press, Catholic.com. And I really enjoyed it, Mike. So thanks for writing this book, and thanks for joining us today.
It's an honor to be on, Bryan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I just want to go through these books. We can never go through all the chapters in one day, so maybe we'll have to have you on again. But I want to go through some of these because there are some really large misunderstandings about Catholicism from the Orthodox churches, especially in regards to church authority, papal infallibility. I mean, how can a man be infallible? And did Jesus, nobody believed that the church was infallible, or especially the Pope was infallible. For the first 1,000 years of the church, no one believed that. That's an invention of the Roman church much later on, or so the Orthodox churches say. So if you don't mind, I'd love to go through some of these objections with you.
Oh yeah, happy to do that. In fact, that's one of my favorite topics, is papal infallibility in the first millennium. Yeah, well, first let's kind of situate this. Whenever we speak about papal infallibility, just so that we're clear, we don't mean impeccability. We're certainly not saying that the Pope is inerrant in everything he ever says. So, if the Pope tells you who is going to win the Super Bowl or something like that, he certainly is not inerrant there. But under certain conditions, whenever the Pope speaks as the pastor of the universal church, and he is speaking on a matter of faith and morals, and he binds the church to a teaching in a definitive way, under those conditions, and only under those conditions, is what he says protected from error. So that's what we're saying whenever we speak of papal infallibility. And
so it's not just anything a Pope teaches. It has to be very specific.
Correct. And so, a Pope could teach in an authoritative setting in a lesser way that is not infallible. That is something he says could be in error. It likely won't be in error. It won't ever be of the grade of heresy. It will never be that erroneous, but it could certainly have some deficiencies in kind of the lower end of the spectrum. So the promise of infallibility is not for those lower instances of teaching authority. It's only for this one high, or the highest instance, what we would call ex cathedra teachings.
Are there a lot of those teachings in the church? Like, does the Pope just make everything, infallible? Because I've heard from Orthodox Protestants that, if he doesn't like something in the Bible, he can just say it because he's infallible. Are there a lot of teachings of infallibility in the church?
Oh, well, yeah, two things going on here. Number one, he could never define something that is contrary to what God has revealed. So if he doesn't like something in the Bible, he could never defined the opposite. Whatever he teaches has to be in line with the deposit of faith, and that's the protection, that it will be in line with what God has revealed, the deposit of faith. And then, as far as, are there many instances of this? Well, you can look in the first millennium, and there's a handful of instances in the first millennium, and also a handful also in the second millennium. So there are a fair amount of instances, but they are in the minority compared to how he normally teaches. In other words, the majority of teachings of the Pope are not infallible in nature, but a minority of those teachings are infallible. Now, there's no particular number on how many of these instances there are. We would just have to look at these individual instances to answer that. Now, at least to my knowledge, nobody's cataloged them exhaustively. But as far as instances of this in the first millennium, that's kind of the question. Is this something that was just made up in the second millennium by Catholics? Or is this something that we can find in the first millennium, which is the heritage that we as Catholics share with the Eastern Orthodox? If we can find instances of this in the first millennium, then we can say, hey, there's a common heritage that we have with Catholics and Orthodox. So this should not be a source of contention and division, but rather this is part of our common heritage, and we need to recognize that. Well, when we look at the first millennium, there are instances of papal infallibility, and not only that, they're and this is taught in the setting of ecumenical councils that are considered authoritative by both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So when we look at our common heritage with the Orthodox, especially the ecumenical councils, and we see the ecumenical councils teaching the notion of papal infallibility, we can simply point out to the Eastern Orthodox, this is not something that we should be divided on, because we both agree with the teachings of these ecumenical councils, and these councils teach papal infallibility. And I can give you examples of that if you would like.
Sure, you can give us an example of that.
My favorite, and it's not the only one, but my favorite is going to be the Sixth Ecumenical Council from 680 to 681, also known as Constantinople III. And in this council, we explicitly see them affirming the concept of papal infallibility. There was a letter written by the Pope at the time, Pope Agatho, and he wrote a letter to the emperor. And this letter was then read out loud at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. The council fathers accept the letter. They write back to Pope Agatho accepting the letter and all of the teachings in it. And one of the teachings in this letter is that the Roman Church has always been free from error in its teachings, and it will remain undefiled unto the end. So it will remain free from error in its teachings all the way to the end, unto the second coming. And that teaching is based on the words of our Lord when he says to Peter, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat, but I've prayed that your faith fail not. The Pope and the Council Fathers agree that verse applies not only to Peter and his teachings, but also to the successors of Peter, the bishops of Rome. So they explicitly affirm the indefectibility, the unfailing authority of the Bishop of Rome and his teachings on faith and morals.
So one of the things, if you don't mind me saying, is like one thing that surprised me about your book was like, not only do you have these quotes, the quotes were very powerful, but not only were they very powerful, like almost like they were written today as like a treatise, but the Eastern bishops accepted them like without hesitation, without argumentation. They just, signed off on them.
Which is why there are Eastern Orthodox scholars who admit the seeds of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 are there in these other ecumenical councils that we have in common with the Eastern Orthodox. And much of the language, in fact, that Vatican I used whenever it defined papal infallibility came from the ecumenical councils. So it wasn't out of nowhere. It was actually building on that heritage that we find in the first millennium. And so this puts Orthodox in an awkward position, because if they reject papal infallibility, they then have to reject the authority of their own ecumenical councils. So rather than this being something to contest and to be a source of division between Catholics and Orthodox, I simply point out that Eastern Orthodox need to embrace their own heritage and their own tradition, which includes papal infallibility. And the book is primarily written for Catholics who are tempted to leave for Eastern Orthodoxy. So I'm pointing out to these Catholics, well, all right, if you're tempted to go to Eastern Orthodoxy, how does this work? Because what you're leaving is you're leaving the Catholic Church that teaches papal infallibility, and you're going to a communion that currently denies it. But that same communion is going to point you to the ecumenical councils as authoritative. And then these ecumenical councils point you right back to papal infallibility. So, these are things that a potential convert from Catholicism to Orthodoxy really needs to work through and consider.
And these are things that Orthodox, when they see that, they actually like, oh, I never noticed that before. And they end up coming back to Catholicism or back to Catholicism.
Yeah, so there's plenty that Orthodox could benefit from whenever they read the book, things that they need to consider, as well as Protestants who are considering, okay, do I go Catholic or do I go Orthodox? This is also something that they need to consider. This will help answer those questions. So though the target audience is primarily Catholics who are thinking about going to Eastern Orthodoxy, an Eastern Orthodox can benefit from the book, and so can a Protestant. So really everyone at the end of the day can benefit from it.
So papal infallibility, you talk about in your book, and you show how it is biblical. You show it is how it is historical. Many people accuse it of being a very late invention, but even Orthodox scholars say, no, it actually comes from early councils that we even accept. And it's been accepted down through history, the primacy of the Roman See and the indefectibility of the church and the promise that was given to Peter that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I mean, all put together, it makes a pretty convincing argument, which leads me to a question. A lot of Orthodox might retort that, well, if you have the Pope, then why do you even need the church? If he could just say stuff, then why do you need ecumenical councils? It seems superfluous.
It's a fair question, because actually Catholics had to struggle with this very question too. Because after Vatican I defined papal infallibility, some Catholics were under the impression we would never ever have an ecumenical council after this. What's the purpose if the Pope can teach infallibly? Well, a couple things going on. Number one, Christ gave us a church that has multiple organs that can teach infallibility, not just the Pope. Or that can teach infallibly, I should say, not just the Pope, but also the College of Bishops, those bishops collectively under the authority of the Pope, but gathered together in an ecumenical council. So Christ gave us multiple ways to teach infallibly, just like he did in the Old Testament. There are multiple means of infallibility that God gave to us in the Old Testament, and I draw that out in the book. In having this doesn't mean that it's redundant. There's in fact benefits for God giving us multiple organs that can teach infallibly. Now, why would, however, in the new covenant, God give us a teaching authority that can teach infallibly through multiple organs, the Pope and the College of Bishops? Pope Leo the Great actually answers this question in the 400s. Pope Leo the Great himself taught infallibly with his tome. It's called Leo's Tome. And that was, of course, read out loud at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and the Chalcedonian fathers accepted it. But what the Pope was teaching there, the Pope determined infallibly prior to the Council of Chalcedon, prior to 451. He taught infallibly through the issuing and promulgation of that tome prior to the council. And then the question was, okay, well, if this was already settled by Pope Leo, why did we still need to have Chalcedon in 451 a couple years later? And why did it need to pass judgment on Leo's tome and accept it if this was already infallible? Leo himself already answers this for us. Leo consented to the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, even though he had already decided on the controversies at the time infallibly. He consented to the bishops gathering together in the council because he wanted there to be a fuller judgment issued. Now, how can you have a fuller judgment on something that is already decided infallibly? Well, let me put it like this. It's one thing for the Pope to teach it infallibly. It's another for all his brother bishops to also come out and say, and we assent to this. That's a fuller judgment. Even though it was already decided infallibly, it's a fuller judgment when they all come together and say, and we agree with this. So that everybody knows where they stand, because there could be some bishops who don't agree with it, and then we'll know that they're not in good standing with the church. But when all of the Pope's brother bishops come together and say, and we agree with this teaching, we believe it, there's a fuller judgment, because it shows that the whole universal church is now backing this up, not just the Bishop of Rome. So even though it was infallible, the Pope had no problem with a fuller judgment being issued. And likewise, we can say even today, why would we still have an ecumenical council? Why did we have Vatican II whenever the Pope could just teach infallibly? Well, so that a fuller judgment can be issued, number one. And number two, because again, Christ did give us the College of Bishops so that they could come together and teach, not just the Bishop of Rome. He didn't just give us the Pope. He also gave us all these other bishops out there for a reason.
Called unity.
So, yeah, for unity. And also to let us know, okay, well, this bishop isn't on board with this teaching. This bishop is not in good standing. This bishop is denying this Christological teaching that has been settled already.
Areas.
Yeah, it lets us know, okay, that person is not in good standing with the Catholic Church. It lets us know where the good people are, where the good shepherds are, and where the unfaithful bishops are.
Now, let's begin here. Like, one Orthodox argument is that Jesus is the head of the church, not the Pope. But the Catholics say that the Pope is the head of the church. Now, when I hear this from Orthodox, the first thing I think about is this is a really poor argument. It's really beneath them. Like, this is a Protestant argument that I feel like maybe they used it first, or maybe they just appropriated it for themselves. But it's either way, it's not a very good argument. And I hear this from Protestants all the time, and I expect them not to understand that, but I don't expect the same thing usually from Orthodox. Maybe I'm expecting too much.
Well, oddly enough, even though the Orthodox apologists often borrow argumentation from the Protestants, in this particular case, it did originate from the Orthodox before the Protestants ever came on the scene.
So they borrowed it from them.
Yeah. In fact, there's a 13th century letter, so around the 1200s, where this was an argument used by an anonymous or an unnamed patriarch in the East. So it actually has some origins going that far back. Yeah, it is a pretty bad argument, which is why Father Alexander Schmemann and others who are Eastern Orthodox scholars and theologians, they recognize, yeah, this is a really bad argument, and we shouldn't be using this as Orthodox. And the reason why this is a bad argument, there's many of them, but if you look at the New Testament, it indicates that the husband is head of the wife. Now, Jesus is also head of all wives, as he's the head of all humans. Is the headship of the husband somehow in opposition to Jesus's headship over all humans, including wives? Of course not, right? So we can make a distinction between Jesus as the invisible head versus the husband as that visible head. Likewise, the Orthodox believe that each bishop is the head of his own diocese, his local church. But no Orthodox is going to say that headship is somehow in opposition to Jesus being the head of that local diocesan church. They'll make the distinction between the visible headship of the local bishop and the invisible headship of Jesus. Well, if that's true on the local level, the local diocese, that's also true of the universal church. We can't say that Jesus is the head of the universal church, therefore the Pope can't be the head of the universal church, any more than we couldn't use that argument on the local level. We would just simply note as Catholics that, yes, Jesus is the head of the universal church as the invisible head. And the Pope is head of the universal church as the visible head. So that distinction has to be granted by Eastern Orthodox because they already employ it elsewhere. But it still does beg the question, okay, well, where does this notion of the Pope as the visible head of the church come from? Well, believe it or not, it's actually in the Orthodox and their own ecumenical councils. It's in at least 3 of their own ecumenical councils: Ephesus, Constantinople III, and Nicaea II, where it explicitly notes that the Pope is head of the churches universally, of the universal churches of God. It explicitly says that of the Pope. So I believe that Orthodox, when they employ this argumentation, not only are they just being inconsistent with their own logic elsewhere, they're being inconsistent with their own tradition. And they're employing an argument that seems to be ignorant of their own ecumenical councils. So I just simply call Orthodox to be faithful to their own tradition. And I again note that any Catholic who's thinking about going to Eastern Orthodoxy, they're leaving a communion that recognizes this truth for a communion that currently rejects it. At least in large parts of it, it currently rejects this notion of the Pope as head of the universal church. But then the Orthodox are pointing these same people to these councils that teach this very thing. So it's an odd situation where we're leaving a communion that recognizes this truth to another communion that largely rejects it, but then they point us to the sources that actually teach it.
Seems to me that a lot of Orthodox people in general just don't realize this. In a sense, they're unknowingly arguing themselves into the Catholic Church, like if they had known this. It's very interesting. And I just want to point out, because we have Protestants, watching this channel as well, that this also is biblical. The ultimate roots are in the Bible. If you read Genesis, 35 to 50, and it talks about the story of Joseph and how he became second in command to the Pharaoh in Egypt, right? And also in Isaiah chapter 22, Eliakim is the royal steward who became second in command under King David. And King David put him, quote, over the house of David, meaning he ruled the house of David in David's place. But David gave all authority to him, and the only person he answered to was David. So everyone went to Eliakim. Same thing with Joseph. Everyone went to Joseph. If the king was away, if Pharaoh was away, who ran the kingdom? They did, because they left him as the steward in his place. It's the same exact thing in Matthew 16:18 of what Jesus did with Peter. He left him as the steward over the church, which is why he's the head of the visible church. But of course, Jesus is the ultimate head and king. Sorry, simple side note.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Yeah, there's biblical roots to all of this.
Yes.
These teachings that the Catholic Church have, they did not just come out of nowhere. They originated in divine revelation, which is obviously going to be found in sacred scripture. And so, yeah, there's biblical roots for all of this stuff.
Now, Orthodox, will come back and say, but every bishop is a successor of St. Peter. So the Pope alone isn't just a successor of St. Peter. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, actually, we find this addressed even in the first millennium with the church fathers. So I would direct Eastern Orthodox to their own heritage. And I would point out that what the church fathers will note is that, yes, in one sense, every bishop is a Peter for their own diocese. Every bishop is that rock for their own diocese. Every bishop is that leader for their own diocese. But that doesn't take a unique way in which the Bishop of Rome is a successor of Peter. And so the fathers who recognize that, yeah, every bishop is a Peter in a sense, they'll also still recognize a unique sense in which the Bishop of Rome is a successor of Peter and is a Peter for the universal church. So, yes, each bishop is a Peter for their local territory, but then you still have the Bishop of Rome who is a Peter for the universal church, for the whole thing. And so it's the Bishop of Rome who is, properly speaking, the successor of St. Peter, whereas you could speak of other bishops in an improper sense as successors of St. Peter. And I draw that out in the book and show them. One witness to this is going to be Gregory the Great. because even Gregory is going to note there's even a sense in which the bishops of Alexandria and Antioch are are I don't want to say unique, but are more privileged successors of St. Peter than any other bishop is. But even Gregory himself notes, but the Bishop of Rome is even more so a claimant to being the successor of Peter, even more than Alexandria and Antioch. And just for context, the reason why he's distinguishing Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch is because Peter, in one way, either directly or indirectly, founded the churches of Antioch and Alexandria and Rome. But he, as the fathers will note, discharged his exercise of authority over the universal church. He discharged that authority uniquely to the bishops of Rome. Those are, properly speaking, his successors.
And all the earliest Christians and historians like Eusebius talk about this. They talk about how Peter and Paul, the two greatest apostles, were in Rome. Therefore, our authority derives from there, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's backed up by history and the earliest fathers as well. So we're talking about the book Answering Orthodoxy, and it's a Catholic response to attacks from the East. And it really does a great job of quoting the early church fathers, quoting history, quoting councils, quoting popes, quoting Orthodox themselves, priests, scholars, authors, notorious people who are well loved and beloved in the Orthodox churches, and it quotes them. And, because many people think, oh, well, the Orthodox don't accept that. The Orthodox don't accept purgatory. Catholics believe that. I hear that all the time. The Orthodox don't accept the Immaculate Conception. That's something papists made up. See, none of these statements are true. And I want the Orthodox to know this, because the Orthodox are, and this isn't a dig, but it's just a truthful statement that they're so divided among themselves that you can't say the Orthodox believe this, because at best you could say some Orthodox believe this. Some Orthodox don't believe in the Immaculate Conception. Some Orthodox don't believe in purgatory, because some do. Some believe it in one way. Some have different understandings of it. Some believe in original sin. Some, so I think it's difficult to say that. And I want to come back to these topics in a minute, but maybe we can start with the topic since we're on this thread of the Pope. Many Orthodox will claim that Pope Gregory the Great, who you just mentioned, who we say is a very firm proponent of the papacy, they will say that, in fact, he denied the papacy. He himself denied the fact that anybody, including the Pope, could have a universal jurisdiction. So therefore, by your own claims, you're proving with your own Pope that it's not true, and that the Eastern Orthodox probably are correct.
Yeah, this one is a fascinating one because it just comes up so often. Yeah, there's a lot going on with it. Number one, you do have the issue where Gregory the Great is reprimanding John the Faster, of the Patriarch of Constantinople, for his use of the title ecumenical patriarch. Ecumenical can mean multiple things. It could mean universal, or it could just refer to the Roman Empire. There's some roots with the term there. And of course, the Bishop of Constantinople represents the city of Constantinople, which was the New Rome, which is New Rome, where, if you recall in church history, the Roman Empire was split into two halves, with one capital being in Old Rome, the city of Rome, and the new capital being in New Rome, Constantinople. And so, since that is where the Eastern Emperor was, and of course you have the Western Empire fall in church history, the Bishop of Rome, as the patriarch of New Rome, the empire there in the East, was considered the ecumenical patriarch, because again, he is the most second in command, second, I should say, almost the most prominent bishop in all of the ecumenical empire, second only to Old Rome. Now, whenever he used this term, all he was saying is that he has this prominence, as the patriarch of New Rome. He's not saying that somehow he is over every other bishop in every other diocese. He's not saying he's this universal shepherd and these other bishops aren't really shepherds. But that's how Gregory the Great understood the Patriarch of Constantinople when he was using the title Ecumenical Patriarch. He was understanding him to say that he is somehow this super bishop over all of these other bishops, this universal bishop, and that these other bishops outside of Constantinople aren't really bishops, So it was kind of a straw man, right? This is not what the Patriarch of Constantinople meant by the title. Gregory misunderstood it. But Gregory writes against this title.
So John the Faster, just to be clear, John the Faster was not using it in the universal sense, but Pope Gregory thought he was, and he thought it sounded like he was making himself the Pope. And so he was basically saying that no bishop outside of the Pope of Rome could ever claim universal jurisdiction, right?
Exactly. That's 100% it. And so there was a confusion in terminology on how the term ecumenical is being used. Are we referring to just the Roman Empire, especially in the East, or are we referring to somehow a headship over the entire universal church? Because of the equivocation of the term ecumenical. So there was a misunderstanding on part of Gregory. So he blasts the Patriarch of Constantinople for using that title and says it's Antichrist to use that title, right? Now, this is where some Orthodox misunderstand, because they then think, oh, you see, even Gregory the Great, the Pope of Rome, is against this notion that the Pope is a universal bishop. There's an equivocation going on here. No, he was condemning a straw man understanding of the term ecumenical. Now we can see that especially in Gregory the Great, because he himself notes that the Bishop of Rome has authority over all of the other bishops, including the Patriarch of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. So he himself recognizes that. So the proper notion of universal bishop, the proper concept of the headship over the universal churches, Gregory affirms. He's just rejecting this straw man understanding of the term ecumenical patriarch, which would somehow mean that all the other bishops aren't actually bishops. The Pope recognizes other bishops are really bishops. It's not like the Pope is the only bishop in the world and these other guys are just filling his spot for him. No, the Pope recognizes they're real, authentic bishops with real authority in their own territory. So there was a misunderstanding in language here. And so rather than Gregory somehow, fighting against the universal supremacy of the Bishop of Rome, he's actually one of its star witnesses, because he himself notes that, yes, the Bishop of Rome does have universal oversight of all of the bishops in the world, including Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch.
Now, you said that Pope Gregory actually affirmed papal supremacy and universal jurisdiction, correct?
That's correct. Not only did he affirm it, he also exercised it.
Like, he's talked about it. Like, we have quotes of Pope Gregory affirming the papacy, universal jurisdiction, Roman primacy, and all of this. So, I don't understand, except that it seems a little bit dishonest to me that they're going to pick this out. And I can understand not understanding the historical context, that it specifically has to do with John the Faster, and he's not making a general statement on that. I can understand people not being aware of the general context. But what I can't understand always is that there's so many pro quotes even by Protestants who say the papacy was started with Pope Gregory the Great because he's such a firm proponent of it. They even see how he speaks, for it. And so I don't understand how they could take this one, but ignore all the rest of the things he said.
I think it's usually due to ignorance. People are taking out this misunderstanding and not aware of everything else that Gregory the Great has said.
You have a quote by chance by Pope Gregory the Great in your book and this chapter that maybe talks about it. I would like to hear it. And I'm sure maybe people might be, I'm not so sure about this, but if we could kind of emphasize the point with a quote, maybe people are like, okay, I could get behind that if there's some evidence.
Yeah, there's actually multiple quotes here in the chapter. Let me go to one here.
And this is in chapter 18, people. So we're talking, there's 30 chapters in this book with 30 different objections. So, there's a lot of quotes and there's a lot of evidence in each one.
Here's one. And this is one of many, which is why, again, I even note Protestant scholars who recognize that Gregory the Great affirms papal supremacy. So even Protestants admit it. But here's just one of many. And it is exceedingly doubtful whether he says such things to us sincerely, or in fact because he is being attacked by his fellow bishops. For, as to his saying that he is subject to the apostolic see, if any fault is found in bishops, I know not what bishop is not subject to it. But when no fault requires it to be otherwise, all according to the principle of humility are equal. So what Gregory is saying is this: look, when there's no problem and no controversy going on in the church, all bishops are equal. But when there is a controversy and bishops disagree with each other on a matter of theology, now the supremacy of Rome kicks in, and Rome gets to say, all of you guys are subject to me, and so I'm going to settle the issue. Everyone else is subject to my decision. So he's saying, in matters of controversy, every bishop is subject to Rome. But in times of peace and no controversy, they're all equal, because there's no controversy to settle.
Yeah, and like you said, that's one of many quotes, and I think there's even stronger quotes than that. But and this, I want to point out that this isn't an us against them. It's not, we're right, you're wrong, we're good, you're bad, we have authority, you have none. Like, it's not what this is about. It really is the way that Jesus established the church when he uniquely gave Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven and gave him, authority to bind and loose and such. He made him the royal steward or the royal vizier, depending on whether you're talking about Egypt in Genesis 35 to 50, or you're talking about the royal steward, which is really an authoritative household as well, a position as well, and an apostolic, one that has succession. So this is what we're talking about in Matthew 16, 18, and 19. All the apostles received authority, Matthew 18, 15 through 18, but Peter uniquely received the keys of the kingdom from Jesus by him. So it gives him a special primacy of authority, having those keys the way he did. So I just want to point that out, that this is biblical, and it really has been this way since the beginning.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, because some people are going to come back and say, well, hey, aren't the keys of the kingdom also given to all of the apostles in Matthew 18? Well, we actually have an ecumenical council that says, yes, the keys of the kingdom are given to all of the apostles in Matthew 18. However, they're initially and principally given to Peter in Matthew 16. So he's the one given the keys primarily. And then in a secondary way, or a mediatory way, the keys of the kingdom are also given to the rest of the apostles. And then that maps onto the successors of the apostles. The Pope, as successor of Peter, is the one who principally holds the keys of the kingdom and the exercise of authority in the church. Whereas the other successors of the apostles, they also have the keys of the kingdom. They also have governance and teaching authority in the church, but in a mediatory way, whereas the Pope has it principally.
Right. Jesus could have just given the keys to all the apostles altogether, but he singles Peter out time and time again and gives him a special authority. John 21, the good shepherd, the gospel of Luke, you bring back your brothers, but I'm going to strengthen you alone, even though Satan wants to sift all of you as wheat. The keys of the kingdom he gives to Peter uniquely. And this has been seen back to the earliest days of Christianity, this unique authority given to Peter. Those are all really, really good points, Michael. So there's so many points that you make in this book, but one of the things I find interesting is that Orthodox will say things like, Catholics, you believe in purgatory, but we don't, as if this is supposed to be some sort of winning argument. Protestants use this, but I find that a lot of the arguments they use are Protestant in nature and don't really help their cause. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the misunderstandings they have of purgatory and the Catholic view of it.
Sure. Yeah, and as you noted earlier, there's some difficulties in this subject because it's kind of hard to pinpoint what do Orthodox believe and reject, since there isn't a unity on many of these decisions. And that's ultimately because they don't have a teaching authority that can unify them and settle these questions. So it's kind of like a version of Protestantism where you can't just say Protestants believe. You kind of have to say, well, this group of Protestants believe this group of Protestants believe that. It's the same for Eastern Orthodox. They're a little bit more structured than Protestants are because they have bishops and they have a synod, but they are less structured than Catholics because they don't have a final teaching authority like the Pope or the ability to hold an ecumenical council. So yeah, there isn't a unified view of the Eastern Orthodox on the question of purgatory. You will find some who will affirm it. You will find others who reject it. Often, however, for those who reject the concept of purgatory, they're rejecting a straw man. They're rejecting this notion that somehow we as Catholics believe that there's a literal fire that the righteous go to and are suffering in prior to their entrance into God and the beatific vision, entrance into heaven. In fact, if you look at the Council of Florence, that was the reunion council between Catholics and Orthodox that the Orthodox eventually repudiated about a decade after the reunion. Um, One of the concerns that the Orthodox had with the concept of purgatory was they were under the impression that the Catholics were saying that, the righteous who have some kind of impurity and imperfection, when they die, they're going to the lake of fire, the same fire that the unrighteous and damned experience. And they were, scratching their heads saying, wait, this is weird because the only fire that we know of in the scriptures is the lake of fire. And that's where the damned go, not where these righteous go who need some purgation. So they were thinking that we're saying that the righteous are going to the lake of fire and going to be damned. And that's not at all what we're saying when we speak of this concept of purgation or the fires of purgatory. Whenever we might speak of the fires of purgatory, and this is not the actual language that the church uses in the dogma, but we often speak of it just kind of in common speech, we're not talking about a literal fire. We're definitely not talking about the lake of fire where the damned go. We're talking about a fire of purgation that purifies the righteous who still have an attachment and imperfections. They still have an attachment to sin in an imperfect way. They're not living in mortal sin or anything like that, but they have venial sins, if you will. There's still some impurity and attachment there. And when we speak of a moment of purgation, we're saying that whenever they die, they have this moment where they encounter God, and God is a consuming fire, as the scriptures indicate. God is fire. And whenever they have this encounter with him, that fire purges the individual of all their imperfections and impurities. So that experience is one of purgation. So we're saying these individuals going through purgatory, what they're doing is they're encountering Christ. They're encountering God, who is an all-consuming fire, and it purges them of imperfections. That's all we're talking about. And I think that Orthodox have to agree that that occurs because they agree that there are people who are not in mortal sin when they die, but they still have an attachment to sin. They still have some imperfections. And they agree God is an all-consuming fire. Okay, so when they encounter God, there's going to be a moment of purgation there where those attachments to sin that they have are purified and they experience that. So ultimately, I think that Orthodox, when we put it in those terms, they actually agree with the concept of purgation. In fact, they even have prayers for the dead for this very reason. So ultimately, when we get through the straw
So,
man presentation of what purgatory is, they actually affirm the concept.
okay, that's what I was just going to say. They basically believe it, but they don't think they believe it because they have a misunderstanding of what we believe from our side, but we basically believe the same thing.
Exactly. That's usually the case with Orthodox on most of these controversies. They actually believe what they're saying, but they have a caricature and a straw man in mind. And we have to cut through the straw man and show them that, no, actually, you believe what we're saying. You just don't realize that you believe this. And so that's part of the problem is cutting through the straw man and the caricatures.
That's why I think that this book is a huge, success. I think it's extremely important for today's day and age so that people can know the truth, which will set them free. We're talking about Answering Orthodoxy, a Catholic Response to Attacks from the East by Michael Lofton. You can find it on Catholic.com, and it's a great book. It answers all the objections in much more detail than we're covering here. And there's so many more. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
All right. So what about the development of doctrine? Like you constantly hear from Orthodox that, we hold, or that's why we're called Orthodox, because we hold to the Orthodox teachings. We are Orthodoxy, whereas Catholics change the teachings of the church. Catholics have changed doctrines. Catholics, have the filioque, which we can cover the next time, and which we recently did a video on. But, the basic bottom line is Catholics have changed teachings where we have held true. But are either of those statements true?
Yeah, this one's an interesting one. I mean, the more informed Orthodox who understand what we're saying whenever we refer to development of doctrine, they'll agree, yeah, we Orthodox also agree with this notion of development of doctrine. But there's a lot of Orthodox who have a straw man in mind whenever they hear us speak of development of doctrine, and they say, well, we reject that and we don't have that in Eastern Orthodoxy. The people who have this misunderstanding think that what we're saying is that doctrine changes and that we get to completely abandon what was revealed to us, and that God reveals one thing to us in the apostolic period and then we can completely change that. That's not development, that's corruption.
That's Mormonism.
That's evolution. Yeah, that's Mormonism. That's not what that's not what we're saying when we speak of development. Development would be what St. Vincent of Lerins says in the first millennium, which they also revere as a saint. They believe that he is a saint. In his Commonitorium, he notes development is, look at a human baby and compare them in their state as an infant compared to them as an adult. It's the same person, it's the same human, it's the same body, but it has organically grown. It's not a different thing. It's not that the baby is now a dog, the baby is now a tree. No, it's that the human baby grows into a human adult. That is what we're referring to whenever we speak of development. And so when we talk about the faith developing, we're not saying that the faith changes from one thing to something completely different. We're saying that it organically grows. And so whenever it's put in those terms,
so it's coming to a deeper understanding, would you say? Is that another way to phrase it?
That is correct. And the Orthodox have to affirm that. And the reason is they have multiple instances of development in their own theology and liturgical practices. The veneration of icons is the perfect example. The veneration of icons is obviously something where some development has taken place. The material that would allow for the veneration of icons, the theology behind it, is apostolic. But were the apostles bowing down to and venerating icons? No. But the theology behind the veneration of bowing down to and venerating an icon is apostolic. But the question of, well, can we do this with images hasn't yet come up. So there is some development to this, but the core, the concept behind it is certainly apostolic. So in other words, if you resurrected one of the apostles from the dead and brought them to a liturgy where we're venerating icons, they're not going to have an issue with it, because the concept, the doctrine behind it, they're the ones who taught it. We're just connecting the dots and showing, in light of these circumstances, in light of these situations, in light of these new questions, here's an application of that doctrine. You can bow down to and venerate an icon with honor. We're not worshiping wood or anything like that, but we're worshiping Jesus, for instance. Whenever we worship Jesus through an icon, it's basically the prototype that we're worshiping. We worship Jesus, not the image, not the wood. right? It's more of a vehicle, if you will, to the actual thing, to the prototype.
I've never understood this argument of theirs, because there's always been development of doctrine. I mean, even with the Trinity and a deeper understanding of Christ and his wills and his natures have been flushed out through councils. Adding homoousios to the Nicene Creed. They're obsessed with adding things to creeds, but we've always done this, and we have the right to come to deeper understanding so we can articulate these teachings more truthfully, more factually, and more perfectly. So I really don't understand their big hang up on this.
Yeah, in fact, one of the Cappadocians, who are highly venerated church fathers in the Eastern tradition, one of the Cappadocians actually taught that the deity of the Holy Spirit and prayers and worship to the Holy Spirit is a development. Mm-hmm. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the concept is there in the apostles. It's part of the apostolic faith. But the explicit question of, is the Holy Spirit consubstantial with the Father? Can we pray to the Holy Spirit? Can we worship him? Those are questions that were answered in time through development.
Yeah. And do you have to go, by the way? Do you have another minute?
Just a minute. Yeah.
If you have to go, we can continue this next time. But I just saw a show with you on there answering an Orthodox priest who was saying the Catholic Church changed this and this and this and this. And you're like, if we're going to turn this around, actually, the Orthodox have many more problems with things they've changed. And I thought that was really interesting. Maybe you can comment for 30 seconds on that.
Yeah. This is one thing that I notice, is that I often see Eastern Orthodox using argumentation that comes back to bite them if you just think through it. They're using unequal weights, as scripture would put it. They're saying, hey, this is a falsification event for you, but if you just apply it consistently to Orthodoxy, it would end up falsifying their own claims. And so often what you could do is you can take the argument that they're using against Catholics and turn it right back around on the Orthodox by showing them, hey, the thing you're arguing against, you yourself actually affirm elsewhere. So you can't use this as a criticism if that criticism turns back around and applies to you. It's just not a good idea to do that. And a perfect example is the Pope the head of the church? And it's like, well, not only do your councils say that he's the head of the church, but you have this very concept there with your bishop, with the head as the husband as the head of the wife. And so if you just apply this consistently, it turns back right around on you and falsifies your own claims. So it's just not a good argument to use.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. Answering Orthodoxy, check it out. I will link it below in the description section, along with Michael's YouTube channel, Reason and Theology, and some of his social media. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you all for tuning in today. Please check out the show description notes, and please support us on Patreon or PayPal. And if you'd like us to be a speaker, check out our website, catholictruth.org. God bless you all. Take care.